Well, I think it's hardwired. My father was fairly shy and he was very quiet. I'm shy and noisy. I don't know how that worked out.
At 78, Linda Ronstadt is done holding back. After decades of staying classy in the cutthroat world of rock and roll, the legendary singer is finally opening up, and she's naming names. In a career that spanned stadium tours, Grammy wins, and emotional ballads, Ronstadt kept her dignity even when fellow musicians crossed the line. But now, with nothing left to prove, she's revealing the 7 artists who left her disrespected, disappointed, or downright disgusted. From backstage betrayals to studio power plays, you'll never guess who made the list and why she never forgot: Frank Zappa. In 1974, Linda Ronstadt crossed paths with a man she once admired, Frank Zappa. They met during a live radio program in Los Angeles, where both were invited as guests. At the time, Linda was one of the most respected voices in country rock. She had already built a reputation for her emotional delivery, genre-blending style, and professionalism. Frank, on the other hand, was a completely different force. Frank Zappa rose to fame in the 1960s with his band The Mothers of Invention, known for their experimental debut album, Freak Out. His music didn't follow rules, it defied them. He combined elements of rock, jazz, classical, and satire, often mocking mainstream culture, politics, and the music industry itself. He wrote long, intricate compositions and demanded technical perfection from his band members. Zappa's lyrics were sharp, his humor biting, and his opinions unapologetically loud. By the early 1970s, Zappa had earned a cult following and critical praise, not for catchy hits, but for being one of the most original and uncompromising minds in music. He was admired by intellectuals and avant-garde fans, but often misunderstood or avoided by mainstream audiences. In private, he was known to be controlling in the studio and famously difficult to collaborate with. Still, Linda was intrigued by his genius. She admired his fearlessness and saw an opportunity to push herself creatively. After the radio program, she expressed interest in recording with him. On the surface, the idea sounded promising. A fearless innovator and a powerful vocalist. Two opposites creating something unexpected. But it didn't go that way. As soon as they entered the studio, the energy shifted. Zappa, used to leading, immediately took control. He disregarded Linda's suggestions, dismissed her creative input, and made it clear that she was there to follow, not contribute. He criticized her voice, calling it too refined for his music. He said her style didn't belong in the chaotic, unfiltered world he was building. During one rehearsal, things hit a boiling point. Zappa stopped the session in front of the full band and accused Linda of trying to commercialize his sound. He said she was making it sound like a jingle. His words were sharp, humiliating, and loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Linda was stunned. She had come into the studio as an equal, an artist with Grammy nominations and hit records under her belt. But here, she was being treated like a novice, a nuisance, an outsider. She didn't finish the session. Overwhelmed with shame and fury, she walked out. Linda never spoke publicly about what happened. She didn't retaliate in interviews or use the media to air her frustration. But in private, she confided to friends that Zappa, though a genius, was also cruel and emotionally cold. What hurt the most wasn't just the creative disagreement. It was the way he dismissed her, made her feel small, and crushed her excitement with a single outburst. Zappa, meanwhile, continued to be the same man he always was. He remained uncompromising, difficult, and widely respected in experimental circles. To his fans, he was a musical prophet, but to many who worked with him, he was impossible. Linda, however, moved forward quietly. She didn't need to control a room to prove her worth. She let her work speak for her. While others clashed and postured, she preserved her peace. But her silence didn't mean she wasn't hurt. That moment with Zappa stayed with her, not because he was famous, but because she had believed in him and he had turned on her. But is he the only one she can't stand? Stay tuned, because the list will shock you. Don Henley, In the early 1970s, something special was starting to happen in Los Angeles. A group of talented musicians, full of dreams and passion, were coming together. This group would later become one of the biggest rock bands in American history, the Eagles. But before the fame, the sold-out tours, and the hit songs, their journey began with a chance meeting and a bit of magic. Before 1971, Glenn Frey and Don Henley already knew about each other. They were both trying to make it in the music industry. They played in different bands and were hustling like so many young musicians in LA. But their paths finally crossed in a powerful way when both of them got hired to play in Linda Ronstadt's band. At that time, Linda Ronstadt was starting to become well known. She needed a good band for her tour, and her producer, John Boylan, was helping her find the right people. Henley sent Boylan some of his songs, hoping to get Linda's attention. She didn't think his songs were a perfect fit, but she loved his drumming. One night at the Troubadour, a famous LA music club, Linda heard Henley play live. His style was emotional, raw, and full of rhythm. She was impressed and asked him to join her band as her drummer. Not long after that, she needed a guitarist, and Glenn Frey stepped in. Bernie Leadon wasn't available, and Frey, who happened to be Linda's boyfriend at the time, was perfect for the job. He had just ended his music duo with J.D. Souther, so the timing was right. Because the tour budget was tight, the band members had to share hotel rooms. Frey and Henley ended up rooming together. They quickly discovered that they had more in common than they thought. They both loved writing songs and wanted more than just playing backup for others. Frey would later say Henley was his secret weapon, quiet, focused, and very talented. It wasn't long before they started dreaming about starting their own band. Boylan saw their chemistry and encouraged them. He told them they could keep working with Linda while preparing their own project. It was a smart move. They got to earn money, rehearse, and bond while on tour. When Bernie Leadon became available, he joined. Boylan also brought in Randy Meisner to play bass. That's how the first version of the Eagles was born. Frey, Henley, Leadon, and Meisner. They practiced in Linda and J.D. Souther's living room. That space became their first studio. One day, they were working on a song called Witchy Woman, blending their voices into smooth, rich harmonies. Linda walked in and froze. She knew she was witnessing something special. The sound, the connection. It was real. Something big was starting. The Eagles soon took off. Their music mixed country and rock in a way that felt fresh and powerful. Songs like Take It Easy, Desperado, and Hotel California made them stars. Their albums sold millions. People played their songs everywhere, from radios to car stereos to stadiums. But success brought problems. The group started having fights. Fame was changing people. Don Henley, once the quiet and serious drummer Linda had discovered, became more proud, more distant. The humble guy she knew was gone. In 1975, things exploded. At the Universal Amphitheater backstage, Henley made a cruel joke about Linda's music, saying she only sang other people's songs. That was a deep insult. Linda didn't ignore it. She kicked him off her tour, right then and there. It was her way of saying, enough. Friends noticed their relationship had changed. Henley was partying, using substances, and acting like a rock god. One day, he even told Linda she was too soft to survive real fame. That broke her heart. She had believed in him, helped him, and now he was treating her like she didn't matter. To Linda, it felt like betrayal. The respect was gone, and their friendship never healed after that. Still, their early days together, touring, rehearsing, sharing dreams, were powerful. They laid the foundation for one of the most famous bands in the world. The Eagles became legends, but it all started in a living room, with harmonies, hope, and a woman who saw their potential. Sometimes, what begins as beautiful music ends in silence, but the impact, it lasts forever. Jim Morrison, Linda Ronstadt, and Jim Morrison were both rising stars in the 1960s Los Angeles music scene. The city was a boiling pot of creativity, filled with clubs, parties, recording studios, and young artists chasing fame. Linda was just beginning to gain national attention as the lead singer of the Stone Ponies, especially after their breakout song, Different Drum, hit the charts. Morrison, by contrast, had already exploded onto the scene as the wild, magnetic frontman of The Doors. By 1967, Morrison's name was everywhere. The Doors' debut album featured Light My Fire, which became a #1 hit. But it wasn't just the music that caught people's attention. It was Jim's presence. He was unpredictable, intense, and unfiltered. His performances were often described as part concert, part spiritual breakdown. On stage, he would scream, whisper, chant, and sometimes completely lose himself in the moment. He wasn't trying to entertain. He wanted to confront, disturb, provoke. Jim was heavily inspired by philosophy, poetry, and surrealism. He idolized Rimbaud and Nietzsche and read them as seriously as he wrote lyric. He saw himself as a shamanic figure rather than a pop star. But his artistic brilliance came with chaos. He drank heavily, used substances constantly, and often alienated even his closest collaborators. While the Doors kept topping charts, their lead singer became harder to manage with every show. Linda and Jim met through mutual friends in this tight, feverish creative scene. The Sunset Strip was their common ground. Places like Whiskey A Go-Go, the Troubadour, and the Roxy were where everything happened. Almost everyone in the industry had crossed paths, whether during late-night jam sessions, impromptu parties, or chaotic backstage hangs. Linda and Jim weren't close, but they noticed each other. Their first real interaction came at a private after-party in the late 1960s, not far from Whiskey A Go-Go. Linda had performed earlier that evening and was invited along with other musicians to an informal gathering. Morrison, already drunk and loud, made a dramatic entrance. He was drinking absinthe straight from the bottle, surrounded by groupies and hangers-on. His eyes were glazed, but he was still sharp enough to command attention. That was always Morrison's talent. He didn't blend into the crowd. He was the crowd. In the middle of the room, Morrison climbed on a small stage set up for impromptu performances. Without warning, he pulled Linda up with him. The room cheered, then quieted. For a second, it was electric. Two stars, face to face. But things spiraled fast. Jim leaned in, tried to kiss her, and completely lost his balance. He fell into a mic stand, knocking it over with a crash. The music stopped. The energy vanished. The crowd stood frozen. Linda, stunned and humiliated, stepped down quietly and left the party soon after. The moment was brief, but unforgettable. In public, Linda said little about the incident. She remained composed, always polite in interviews, but the sting stayed with her. Years later, when Morrison's name came up, she referred to him not as a rock god, but as a damaged genius. In private, she admitted the encounter changed how she saw the male-dominated music world. Morrison wasn't just reckless. He was celebrated for being reckless, no matter the damage he caused. Their paths never truly crossed again. Morrison continued to spiral. His concerts became more erratic. In 1969, he was arrested in Miami for exposing himself on stage. By 1971, he was living in Paris, hiding from the press, drinking heavily, and writing poetry. That July, he was found dead in his bathtub at age 27. No autopsy was ever performed. His death became the stuff of rock legend. Linda, meanwhile, kept rising. She built her career through hard work, artistic control, and personal restraint. She didn't burn stages down. She lit them up with grace and power. She represented a new kind of artist, unapologetic but respectful, bold but composed. In the end, the difference between them couldn't have been clearer. Jim Morrison represented the dark, unstable edge of rock fame, brilliant but destructive. Linda stood for something steadier, talent without chaos, success without spectacle. Neil Young. In the 1970s, Linda Ronstadt and Neil Young were two of the biggest names in rock music. They first crossed paths because they shared a deep love for songwriting and authenticity. Their collaboration began when Linda provided backing vocals for Neil's hit song Heart of Gold. In 1974, they toured together, performing for massive crowds in sold-out stadiums across the country. At the time, Linda was still on the rise. She had released a few well-received albums, but her signature sound and superstar moment were still building. Most of her performances were in more intimate venues where her soft, emotional voice made the biggest impact. Joining Neil's tour was a huge opportunity. It put her in front of larger audiences and aligned her with an already established legend. Neil Young's rise to fame had been quick and undeniable. After moving to Los Angeles in the mid-1960s, he first made his mark with the Canadian-American band Buffalo Springfield, whose hit, For What It's Worth, became an anthem of the protest era. But it was his solo career, and especially his work with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, that made him a household name. His deeply personal lyrics, raw guitar work, and willingness to challenge political and social norms made him a unique voice in rock. By the early 70s, Neil had released albums like After the Gold Rush and Harvest, both of which were critically acclaimed and commercially successful. Harvest, which featured Heart of Gold, shot him to the top of the charts. He was seen as both a poet and a protester, an artist who could speak to the personal and the political with equal force. But Neil wasn't easy. He was known for his unpredictable nature, abrupt decisions, and uncompromising standards. Even those who admired him knew he could be difficult. Linda discovered this for herself on tour. Though they shared a mutual respect for music, their personalities clashed. Linda was collaborative, open, and warm. Neil was intense, private, and stubborn. As the tour continued, the contrast between them grew more obvious and more tense. In 1976, the tension exploded during a benefit concert for farm workers. What began as a night of solidarity turned into something far more painful. Neil, deeply committed to activism, objected to what he felt was commercial-sounding music being played at the event. Linda's polished, radio-friendly style didn't sit well with him. Without warning, he took over the stage, overshadowing her performance and pushing aside her contributions. The evening ended in tears for Linda. To make matters worse, Neil later made a public statement that cut even deeper. He claimed Linda wasn't capable of writing real protest songs. For Linda, who came from a family with a strong tradition of Mexican-American activism, the comment was more than criticism. It felt personal. She had been raised on fairness and justice. Being called superficial by someone she had looked up to was devastating. After that night, Linda made a firm decision. She would never work with Neil again. She turned down every offer to collaborate, no matter how promising. The wound was too deep. Neil, however, continued to mention her in interviews, sometimes complimenting her, sometimes throwing subtle jabs. To Linda, it felt like a mix of regret and ego. Whatever it was, it only deepened the distance between them. In the end, their musical partnership ended as quickly as it began. The respect was gone, and though they both moved forward with successful careers, the hurt from that one night never fully disappeared for Linda. Neil, in her eyes, became someone who preached about truth and justice, but failed to extend that same grace to others. David Crosby. In the 1960s, Linda Ronstadt and David Crosby were two young artists chasing their dreams in Los Angeles. At the time, the U.S. was going through a lot of change. There was political unrest, protests, and cultural shifts. While British bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones ruled the charts, something special was brewing on the West Coast. Los Angeles, especially the Laurel Canyon area, became a home for a new kind of music. It was led by singer-songwriters who wrote personal, emotional songs. These artists didn't just want to entertain, they wanted to tell the truth about life, love, and the world around them. Linda and David were swept up in this movement. They often performed at the Troubadour, the famous music club where many careers began. It was a place where you could walk in as a nobody and walk out with a record deal. In that small, smoky club, Linda and David met other rising stars, like Joni Mitchell, Jackson Browne, and Mama Cass Elliot. These weren't just musicians. They were part of a community. They shared songs, instruments, advice, and dreams. Linda Ronstadt had a voice that was pure, powerful, and full of emotion. She could sing a soft ballad and make an entire room fall silent. David Crosby had a brilliant mind for harmonies and arrangements. He was a key part of bands like the Byrds and later Crosby, Stills, and Nash, helping to shape the rich, layered California sound that defined an era. Though they were very different in personality, Linda and David admired each other's talent. They both hated playing by the rules and were bold about speaking their minds. Fame didn't change their love for making music, but it did make life harder. Even when they were surrounded by people, both of them often felt deeply alone. They preferred the quiet magic of the recording studio over the chaos of touring. In the early 1970s, Linda and David began working on music together. They shared ideas, jammed in the studio, and explored different musical styles. But things took a dark turn. By the mid-1970s, David Crosby was dealing with serious substance addiction. His ego had also grown with his success, and he began pushing people away. Linda, who had always been kind and collaborative, started to feel the cracks in their partnership. The breaking point came in 1978 during a recording session. They were working on a harmony track together, and Linda suggested adjusting the pitch to suit her voice better. Crosby refused. He told her to change instead. The argument that followed wasn't private. It happened in front of engineers and other musicians, and word quickly got out. What made it worse was what happened after. David Crosby made comments to the press, saying Linda wasn't a real musician. He claimed her success came from studio tricks and good producers, not talent. These words were especially painful because Linda had always taken pride in her voice and work. Being told she wasn't authentic felt like a slap in the face. She was heartbroken. She had looked up to David Crosby, respected his artistry, and shared a genuine connection with him. But now she saw him as someone who had let fame and addiction ruin his character. She decided to cut him out of her life completely. After that day, Linda refused to work with Crosby again. Even when others tried to bring them back together for projects, she said no. She didn't speak about it often, but the pain stayed with her. Crosby, however, kept mentioning Linda in interviews, sometimes with faint praise, other times with backhanded compliments. To her, it felt like he still couldn't take full responsibility for what happened. Over time, their story became one of missed chances and broken trust. What began in harmony ended in silence. Linda came to see Crosby as a symbol of how ego, addiction, and fame can destroy something beautiful. Paul Simon. Despite looking like a perfect match on paper, working together as artists doesn't always lead to magic. Sometimes, when strong personalities and creative minds collide, what starts as a dream collaboration turns into a painful experience. That's what happened when Paul Simon and Linda Ronstadt tried to work together. Instead of creating something beautiful, the session ended in conflict and lasting emotional damage. It was 1982. Both Linda and Paul were at the top of their careers. Linda had become one of the most respected female vocalists of her time, while Paul Simon was already considered a songwriting genius. He had gained worldwide fame as part of Simon and Garfunkel, with classics like The Sound of Silence, Mrs. Robinson, and Bridge Over Troubled Water. Paul had later gone solo and released a number of successful albums, praised for his poetic lyrics and bold experiments with world music. He was known for being incredibly detailed when it came to music. Some admired his perfectionism, others found it overwhelming. Either way, Paul was used to being in control of his studio sessions. That year, Paul invited Linda to record a duet for his upcoming album, originally titled Da Cow. On the outside, it looked like a brilliant plan, two of the most powerful voices of the era joining forces. But as soon as they began working, things started to unravel. Linda came in ready to collaborate, but it quickly became clear that Paul wasn't really interested in sharing the creative space. He was meticulous to the point of being controlling. During practice, he constantly interrupted her, offering feedback that felt more like commands than suggestions. He picked apart her vocal takes, criticized her delivery, and even wanted to change lyrics she felt strongly about. Linda began to feel like she wasn't seen as an equal. Instead of being treated like a respected artist, she felt like a student being corrected in a music classroom. Each suggestion from Paul chipped away at her confidence. She didn't feel free to sing in her own style. She felt judged. What was supposed to be a short, smooth session dragged on. By the end, there was no song, no finished track, just frustration. Paul never spoke about the failed collaboration publicly. He moved on quietly, leaving it behind. But Linda didn't forget. To her, the session was more than a bad day at work. It was a moment where she felt completely disrespected and dismissed. She left the studio with a heavy heart and a firm decision. She would never work with Paul Simon again. Linda wasn't upset simply because they didn't record a good song. She was hurt by the way she was treated. She had entered the studio as a respected, award-winning artist, but left feeling like her ideas didn't matter. She wasn't heard. She wasn't honored. She wasn't treated as an equal partner. She later spoke about how creativity without respect is not worth the effort. The pain of that collaboration stayed with her, even though she continued to rise in her career. It was a reminder that no matter how famous someone is, kindness and mutual respect matter more than talent. What makes this story even more powerful is that Paul Simon wasn't trying to be cruel. He was simply being himself, thorough, perfectionist, and perhaps too focused on getting things just right. But in doing so, he forgot something essential. Collaboration means sharing space, not dominating it. Linda Ronstadt had always been brave when it came to standing up for herself. Whether it was refusing to take orders from producers or walking away from toxic partnerships, she stayed true to who she was. This failed session with Paul Simon was just one more example of her knowing when to walk away. In the end, no song came from their meeting, but the story itself speaks volumes. It shows how even two musical legends can clash if respect isn't at the heart of the process. For Linda, the emotional cost was too high, and she made sure she never put herself in that position again. Elvis Costello. In addition to butting heads with perfectionists, Linda Ronstadt sometimes encountered the opposite, people who brought an entirely different kind of energy. One such moment happened in 1979 when she attended a music festival in Cleveland. Another performer there was Elvis Costello, a rising star known for his sharp tongue and rebellious image. At the time, Costello was gaining attention as one of the boldest voices in new wave music. This genre came out of the punk movement, mixing edgy lyrics with experimental sounds. It was a new style that challenged traditional rock and pop. Elvis was young, clever, and often very sarcastic. His fans loved his wit and confidence, but to others, he came off as cold and arrogant. Linda, by contrast, came from the rock and country rock scene. Her music was emotional, sincere, and heartfelt. She sang from the soul. She didn't try to shock people. Her goal was to move them. The two artists couldn't have been more different in style or personality. At a press event before the show, Costello made a rude joke about Linda's music. Without even speaking to her, he said her performance was the kind of background music you'd hear at brunch. Not something that mattered. The comment was cruel, and Linda was deeply hurt. She had always taken her music seriously and poured her heart into every performance. To be dismissed like that felt like a slap in the face. She tried to confront him backstage that night. She approached him calmly, hoping to clear the air. But instead of listening or apologizing, Costello was drunk and disrespectful. He brushed her off, insulted her again, and walked away. That brief exchange left a strong impression on Linda, and not a good one. She didn't just see Costello as rude, she saw him as the kind of artist who placed intelligence above kindness, and who used his sharp mind to tear people down. To her, that wasn't edgy. It was mean-spirited. It was a kind of coldness she wanted nothing to do with. Ironically, Elvis Costello later admitted he had gone too far. In a 1980s interview, he confessed that he had been immature and out of line during those years. He even acknowledged that Linda's cover of his song Allison had brought him royalties. But for Linda, the damage had already been done. Costello had been seen as a voice of rebellion, someone challenging the status quo. But Linda believed rebellion without grace and respect was empty. Her music came from a place of honesty and heart. Being dismissed by someone who didn't value those things made her feel like an outsider in a world she had helped shape. This moment, like many others in her career, reminded her that talent alone wasn't enough. Character mattered more. Whether she was dealing with controlling collaborators like Paul Simon, clashing with egos like David Crosby, or enduring sarcasm from artists like Costello, Linda learned that the music industry could be brutal, but she didn't have to let it harden her. She held on to her integrity. She continued to sing with honesty, and she stayed true to herself, even when others didn't. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.